Trauma, PTSD, abuse. These seemingly simple words can hold a great deal of meaning, pain, and often escapable charge. Although the significance of these terms can be diluted by misuse or overuse, there's nothing light or unimportant about the profound, lasting effects of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and other experiences that leave devastating and often deeply hidden scars. Alarmingly, 1 in 3 women is subjected to physical or sexual abuse in her lifetime, too often at the hands of a partner. We tend to believe that trauma should just heal on its own, but the truth is that trauma, if left unaddressed, only festers and worsens over time. What is the cure? Support, loads of TLC, empathy, and gentle forward momentum. Today, we'll focus on this listener's real-life question. I was abused by my mother's boyfriend when I was really young. I told her, but she didn't believe me. The abuse continued until they eventually broke up a few years later. I'm in my late 20s and still have nightmares. My relationships tend to be short-term and full of drama. If things go beyond a hookup, I get really anxious and angry. I can't afford therapy. What can I do to get better? And with that question as the focus of today's episode, I'm Dr. Carla Marie Manley, and this is Imperfect Love. Please note, as this episode contains sensitive information, listener discretion is advised. If you need support, please see the special links in the show notes.
Welcome to Imperfect Love with Dr. Carla Marie Manley, psychologist, author, and relationship expert. I'm here to help unravel mysteries and misconceptions about love, relationships, and mental health issues, plus everything in between. Love is complicated, people are not perfect, and relationships surely can be tough. Together, we'll navigate this messy, imperfect space of real life.
Today, I'm joined by a very special guest, Maya Golden Bethany, award-winning journalist, novelist, and mental health advocate, who will be sharing her expertise on healing from trauma, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and perfectionism. Welcome to the podcast, Maya. It is such a joy to have you.
Thank you so much for having me on and the opportunity to share with your listeners. I truly appreciate it.
I appreciate you and you making the time and space to be with us today. So before we launch into the podcast, could you tell our listeners just a little bit about what makes you you?
Well, it's funny that you would ask that because I think historically I probably would have struggled with trying to figure out how I identify myself because for a long time my identity was wrapped up in how others perceived me. And so today I would say I am, above all things, I'm a mother. I am a wife. But as far as who Maya is and the things that make her who she is, it's creativity, it's joy for making other people smile, it's a willingness to help and show empathy to humanity. And it's a long trek through life to leave a trail of goodness in my wake.
Oh, that's so beautifully put. To leave a trail of goodness in your wake. I love that. So when we look at your trek and what's made it different, meaningful, not that we don't all have our own meaningful treks, but you have quite a history. And in so many respects, you are an award-winning journalist, you're a novelist, you have started a foundation for those who suffer from mental health issues, including abuse, addiction. You really want to do good in a way that empowers women, empowers people in general who have suffered at the hands of violence, of abuse. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey?
I think for me, it came with the realization we hear so much and so often in the mental health community, you are not alone. But growing up as a child who experienced sexual abuse, as a child who suffered incest and sexual assault as a teen, I did feel tremendously alone because I grew up in a community and in an area where we don't talk about those things, and family businesses kept within the family or swept under the rug. And I believed in that loneliness of feeling that I was the only child, the only girl to go through this situation, that I was isolated and that my mental health struggles were solely unique to me. And that doesn't discredit the fact that every one of us is an individual and that we are unique, but there is a commonality to the symptoms many times of complex PTSD or our relationships being impacted by the abuse, especially when we develop core beliefs as children that our identity is wrapped up in that abuse. We feel unclean, we feel dirty, all of those things that children don't have the capability to process. And so for me, once I was fortunate enough to receive the care that I did a 6-day intensive for the PTSD and for addiction recovery. I had been in therapy for a number of years, but that intensive was really the key to unlocking the heart of so many issues and for me to understand that I wasn't alone. And I wanted to be able to gift that feeling, that realization to other people, to provide them with support. We all want to be seen and heard, but I think when there is that common thread between us where we can say, I was sexually abused, or I was assaulted, or I was in a horrible abusive relationship, and it might not be the same conditions, but someone can listen to your experience and just nod their head and say, I know what that feels like. I wanted to provide that community to other people. And I wanted to also share my story authentically for that reason as well. And so I've made it a mission. I won't say it's an easy mission, but I've made it a mission to do both, to create community, to provide healthcare support, especially for those who lack access to mental health care. I am located in rural Texas, East Texas, and our mental health resources here are few and far between when it comes to psychiatrists or counselors and social workers. So I saw the need and wanted to do what I could just as one person to fill the gap. But in doing so, it was very important for me to make people feel like someone was coming alongside of them and saying, I understand and I see you and I hear you and I know exactly what that feels like.
Thank you for that very rich and personal and heartfelt background. And before we go any deeper, because this is such a sensitive realm, and we know that according to the World Health Organization and other statistics, that we have that statistic of 1 in 3. So when we look around a room of other women, we can say, okay, I'm looking at three, and one of those has likely been the victim of sexual or physical assault. Be- and we also have a statistic of 1 in 4 when we're looking at any sort of abuse in relationships. And those are huge numbers when we can look at, you know, 3 women and say, one of you has been victimized, or another group and say 1 in 4 of you have undergone some sort of maybe emotional abuse, which of course I'm not minimizing that. That can be one of the worst forms of abuse. And the psyche, as research shows us, verbal abuse, mental abuse can be as painful as physical abuse and registers similarly in the body and the brain. So let's get some working definitions for our listeners who might not quite understand the difference between PTSD, complex PTSD, and we'll start there because these terms are so often, thrown around in social media and in life. So let's just dial it down to what we mean when we're talking about those today.
As you said, we see so often on social media, and I do cringe at the way that those terms are used because they're very real and it's not to be minimized. The symptoms that go along with them. PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, is often attributed to symptoms that stem from one particular incident in life. So, a singular incident, and it doesn't have to be abuse. It could be a car accident. It could be witnessing a crime. It could be the secondhand trauma of watching someone who is losing their life and the battle of that as well. So it can come in many different forms, but it's usually attributed to one event where you can pinpoint and say, if you're skittish in the car, it might be because you were in a car accident, or you don't want to leave the house or go for a drive because of that. Your behaviors may vary. You might experience anger, depression, some ideologies, some thoughts that are intrusive or negative about self-harm, and it can impact your relationships as well. We most often hear about PTSD being attributed to the military and soldiers. What we don't often associate it with as a public whole is sexual assault or abuse or childhood traumatic events. Complex PTSD, complex post traumatic stress disorder, is when during the course of your life you have experienced multiple traumatic events of varying types. So it could be that you experienced abuse for a number of years in those different forms. It might have been physical, it might have been sexual, it might have been emotional abuse. Maybe you did witness a crime. Maybe, unfortunately, in the way society is today, that you were in an event of a mass shooting or something of that nature that can have those lingering effects. But it's basically a compounded number of traumas in your life and how they begin to show up. And the way that, for me personally, that the complex PTSD showed up, I didn't quite understand until I went to the 6-day intensive and went to treatment. But I had suffered sexual abuse for a number of years. I had witnessed domestic violence in my family. I was a reporter. I was a news reporter and worked at the crime beat. So I saw all manner of human atrocities, and I didn't recognize what that was doing to me.
Mm.
So there was a lot of rage. I had a lot of anger. My relationship suffered. I was a perfectionist to cover up the feeling of not being good enough. And that's very common with complex PTSD. When you've been through so many multiple traumatic events, there's sort of this, why does this keep happening to me? Or why am I going through these things? And it creates a feeling of not being enough. And so that can create perfectionism. It can disrupt relationships. It can disrupt your health. So you can have weight gain, weight loss, sleeplessness. Chronic illnesses is also a symptom of complex PTSD. So chronic respiratory issues. It basically comes from your system, your body being in a
Mhm.
heightened state of alert constantly, because that's how you have lived. That's how you have been able to survive. Your body doesn't know we are not in survival mode anymore. So if your anxiety level is always at 100, but your actual stress level is somewhere around 50, then the cortisol in your body is not coming down the way that it should. And when that happens, you can get a number of illnesses. So you can see things like bronchitis or susceptibility to flu and cold much more easily than others. So complex PTSD, that's how it varies from PTSD, in that again, it's a it's multiple traumatic events of varying kinds that have compounded over a lifetime, and the symptoms can be more severe. And that's not to minimize PTSD, because obviously it is in itself a very intense condition. But I think in 2024, we can safely say a lot of us have experienced multiple traumas in our lives. And it's just now starting to be recently recognized that complex PTSD is an actual step beyond the original PTSD diagnosis.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that thorough overview of PTSD and complex PTSD. And for, we'll backtrack just a little bit. I am with you when you say there's something cringeworthy when we hear these terms not intentionally abused or misused, but when somebody says, "Oh, I didn't get the dress I wanted, I have PTSD," or "My manicure went awry," or "My date was bad," or "My car tire is getting low, I have PTSD." When we do that, we're inadvertently diminishing the impact that true PTSD and complex PTSD have on the many millions of people suffering from those mental health issues. So I agree with you. There is something, so we can all be a little bit more mindful sometimes about how we use words, especially those that have an impact on mental health. The next thing I really want to thank you for bringing up is that very clear difference between PTSD and even, our war vets are often diagnosed with a singular PTSD, but they too have, I've volunteered with vets, and most of them actually have complex PTSD because it is many of our soldiers had very difficult childhoods. And then they go into situations that we're simply not prepared for. And then they come home and they're thrown back into life. They might have TBI, traumatic brain injury, and other things. So we want to realize and honor that PTSD and complex PTSD really show up in different ways, and we don't need to diagnose someone or go around saying, oh, this person has this or that, but realizing it's okay, and not only okay, but important to reach out for mental health support so that you can understand what might be happening to you or a loved one. The next piece I really love that you brought up is the part about we all experience trauma in different ways. And when I'm working with someone who has PTSD, sometimes they'll say, oh, I didn't have it as bad as someone else, or why did this happen to me and this other person's not traumatized by it? And I use the image of let's all get on board a little airplane, right? And we have one person who is already suffering from anxiety, somebody who just had a few beers. We have someone else who's working on their computer during the flight. We have a mom with a child, and then we have somebody who's taken an anti-anxiety med. And that plane starts going down. Each one of those individuals, and we're assuming the plane, survives, will have, because they're in a different place. One is busy with work, one is on alcohol or using alcohol, one has taken medication, the other one has a child to worry about. Each individual will experience that traumatic event differently. Some may develop PTSD, others may go, didn't affect me at all. And so I think that's important for us to realize because sometimes people compare themselves to someone else. And I've even had rape victims say, well, I didn't have it so bad. I've been only once in my life. Whereas one of my girlfriends has been raped 3 times. And it's trauma is not something we want to compare. We don't, it's not like a dress where we want to compare colors. It's absolutely an individual experience that is, I believe, and I'm wondering your opinion because this is my understanding in my work, that trauma and our susceptibility to it is partly environmental, partly our personal history, and our genetics. And so we will likely have different responses to different life experiences. What is your thought on that?
I agree wholeheartedly because I have seen in situations where how our past can bring up our reaction to something very differently than someone else. And so, as you mentioned with the plane analogy, someone might walk away from a situation and not have the same exact reaction as someone else, but because of that other person's past history, their childhood experiences, maybe a predisposition to already, plane, flying anxiety, then it's a confirming of their worst fears, and so it starts to spiral. And it's the same with the military. You alluded to that earlier. Not every soldier comes back with PTSD or complex PTSD, and that's no reflection on the strength of that individual. It's no reflection on their mental fortitude. It is what they're bringing into the situation as they go forward. It is their past or whatever trigger there is in that moment that they react to. And so sometimes we can be triggered in a situation and not understand where it comes from. It can be a smell, it can be a sound, it can be a name. And we get to see that a lot of times when my foundation offers group support. And I hear the clients of this support group often talking about, I was having a panic attack or an anxiety attack during a thunderstorm or severe weather, and my husband was fine, or my partner was fine. Well, it might be that that partner grew up in an area where severe weather happens all the time. It's no big deal. And it might be that that other person grew up in a situation where they survived a tornado once before, and here they are again. And so we're all reacting differently because of our past experiences. What we hope to do is to be equipped with ways that we can respond with a little bit more grace to ourselves and healthy action than to internalize, to verbally berate ourselves, to physically harm ourselves in worst cases, and to seek help and support. So I do agree that we all react to things differently based on how we grew up or based on our perceptions of the world or our core beliefs that we developed even as children.
Very much appreciate so many things that you're saying, and I want to pause on the part because it's so critical. People who suffer from anxiety, depression, PTSD, complex PTSD, often think they're weak. And I so appreciate that you highlighted the fact that having a mental health issue on your plate does not at all mean you are weak. It simply means you have suffered. It doesn't mean you're weak if you're out and you're, mountain climbing and you fall and you have a broken leg or a broken arm. We don't look at that as a weakness. And I appreciate that you brought this up because I agree with you. So many people think I better tough it through this or not tell anybody because I will be seen as weak or I brought this on myself. I was abused because I did something wrong. I was sexually assaulted because I wore clothes that were too skimpy or was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wait, pause, hard stop. Being sexually abused, emotionally abused, physically abused, neglected, any of that is never your fault. It is never anybody's fault. So, listener, if that tape is running in your head, it is never anybody's right to abuse another human being. It is not your fault, and it doesn't make you weak. I like to flip that a bit and say, when you come forward and you want to change your life, as you are doing, you've changed your life. You've created a mission. Not everyone's going to want to make a mission out of healing, but when you reach forward for support, oh my goodness, that's such courage. When I'm working with, survivors of sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, all of those things, I have such appreciation for my clients because it takes such strength to not self anesthetize with all sorts of behaviors that are harmful in the long term and to step forward and want to change your life, to want to heal. What is your thought about that?
I think, unfortunately, a lot of us hit a rock bottom before we feel the desire to pull ourselves up or want to change. And in a very twisted way, those rock bottoms create opportunity. I'm not praising them because I've had numerous of my own, but I think when we're able to look inward and say, I want to change, I want to be better, I know life isn't supposed to be this way, I want more for myself. That is a form of self love, whether we recognize it or not. And that's probably one of the hardest steps of that entire process is to say, I want better than this. I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like this. I don't like who I am when I'm in this position. And to want to change that. And it does take a tremendous amount of courage. It is not easy to walk into a counselor's office for the very first time and sit down and start opening up. I have jokingly said in my book, I refer to a counselor, and I jokingly said to her one of these many years later that I wasted your time for a year and a half because I didn't talk about any of the root causes of what I was going through. I talked about the anger, and I talked about being irritated and feeling stressful and having stomach pains, but I was never talking about the root of it because to dig that deep was frightening. It was terrifying, and I didn't want to vocalize that to anyone. But in order to get better, I had to. And that takes courage. And I'm not commending myself, I'm commending every other person that has the ability to do that. And it wasn't a waste of time for that counselor by any means. It was letting me move at my pace in a way that was comfortable to me, which I now understand. And once we got to the heart of things, once we got to those core beliefs, that little girl who wanted a seat at the table, who was still, screaming in the back of my mind to say things and to speak up, I started to feel the need to do so for that child, really. And I would encourage anyone who has experienced any type of abuse or trauma, whether they were a child, whether they were an adult, whether it's been recent, whether it's been 20 years ago, to look inward and to see how it's impacting relationships, to see how you feel about yourself. What negative thoughts do you have? What negative talk do you have? And what steps can you take to change that? What support resources are there? If you feel that you can't afford therapy or to meet with a counselor, what alternatives are there in your community? There are a number of resources online now available to people as well. And so I really believe that mental health warriors, as I call them, it's a tremendous amount of faith. And I don't necessarily mean spiritual faith. I mean faith in yourself that you can do this. You can pull yourself up. It takes work. It takes energy. It's not going to feel great every single moment. The people around you might not understand it, but you're not doing it for them. You're doing it for yourself. And for that, I salute anyone who takes the step forward in that journey.
Thank you for pausing and really fleshing out that piece because everyone has their own way of healing once they reach out for support. That's the first piece, as you were saying. And if you go to a group session or sessions or individual therapy, your pace, your psyche generally knows, okay, I can do a little bit more work today. Oh, okay, this is a rest day. I don't want to think about it today. And when we do that, we are really helping the psyche honor that it has its own pace, that we each are individuals, and that healing, especially when it's trauma, that healing can take a lifetime. And and it's not a one and done thing. It is often we get through the big bulk of it often in a year, 2, 3 years, but it will still keep popping up. And I agree with you. So for our listeners and the individual who wrote in, that it sounds as if you're saying, okay, you reaching out and saying, what can I do? That act of courage of just saying, how can I fix this? How can I get through this? And then surveying yourself, looking at how it's impacting you is step one. That's step one. Let's just look at how it's holding you back in life, in your relationships, in self love, in self care, in negative beliefs. And then look at, as the person who wrote in today for this, episode, we look at this individual saying, I'm okay with hookups, but anything that gets beyond that, more intimate, there's a lot of dysfunction happening, a lot of chaos. And so this they are already on the track of knowing that it's not healthy. We don't know if there's substance abuse or not, but reaching out for support, and substance abuse is so common when there's unaddressed PTSD and complex PTSD because people want to self-soothe. They don't want to hear those voices and feel those negative feelings, so they get some relief. Unfortunately, that relief lasts only as long as the substance lasts in their system. So another piece that you brought up, so you brought up individual therapy, you brought up group therapy, and you brought up something that our listeners might not be familiar with, an intensive. And before I ask you to describe what an intensive is, I also just want to pause on group therapy because as part of getting my master's and my doctorate, I had to do group therapy. And oh my goodness, group therapy can be intimidating. And that's why they have you do it, because they want you to know what it's like to be on the other side. And doing group therapy, you're going into a room where you imagine that everyone else, at least this was my situation, everyone else must be more together. Everyone else must have had an easier life. Everyone else must be, you know, they're doctors, lawyers, whatever they are. They've got to have it more together than I do. And the truth is, and that's why I really learned that piece, that we are all so alike, so much more alike than we think. The doctor next to you, or the attorney, or the firefighter, they likely, one in three of them, has suffered some form, likely, of physical or sexual abuse. And so we have these preconceived notions that it must be some other type of person, whatever that is. And so for me, the power of group therapy, and I ran a women's support group for years, and it was quite a large group. And oh my goodness, the work that can be done in support groups where you listen to other people and you heal through listening, just listening alone. And then you heal through sharing your story and asking questions when the time is right for you. So I absolutely am with you on the power of group therapy. So let's talk a little bit about what you mean by an intensive.
Well, an intensive is a concentrated effort over a span of so many days. In my case, it was 6 days, but they vary in length. Some are 6 days, some are 14 days, or any given period of time. But it is really a chance to focus solely on individual mental health in an environment and a setting that only allows you to focus on your thoughts, being present, your feelings, your emotions, and it's led by if you're fortunate enough to be in that situation, it's led by a licensed trauma specialist or a counselor or a psychiatrist, but they work with you in a group setting, as you mentioned. Usually you are with 4 to 5 other people, but sometimes the groups can be larger depending on the number of mental health care specialists available. But they really work with you at the heart of what is causing your addiction, what is causing your substance abuse, And substance abuse, as you mentioned earlier, can be such a broad category because it can be alcohol, it can be drugs, it can be food, it can be sex, anything that you are using to numb your feelings and your emotions. And they also work with you on your beliefs about yourself. So I mentioned earlier that one of my core beliefs as a child was I wasn't good enough because I was being abused. So something was wrong with me. I was dirty. And then on the flip side of that, I developed the unintentional, but with a child's mind, developed this belief that I only existed for the pleasure and gratification of other people. So whether that was physical gratification or that was emotional, being the people pleaser, being the go-to person to support them, say yes to everything, never saying no, burning myself out by trying to achieve and not drop the ball, keeping spinning plates in the air. And so we worked through the heart of that. And when they say intensive, I do not use that word lightly. It is not to put fear in anyone, but it is an extreme because we didn't have access to television. We did not have our phones, and we weren't allowed to listen to even music. We had to sit with our thoughts. And so anytime that we were not actually in group therapy or working on our individual worksheets, we talked about different subjects from codependency to eating disorders. We really learned self-care. And during that time, we did some body-based healing methods as well. So it wasn't a matter of just cognitive therapy or talk therapy. It was also what some people might call untraditional, but trauma release exercises. We did some family of origin sculpting where other members of the group had to pretend to be a family member and berate us and how we responded to that. And when we say intense, yes, because it puts you in a situation where you have to be vulnerable. You have to open up. And I had a hard time even being vulnerable in those first few days. And I wondered if it was going to happen for me. And I even joked that I was just going to fake it till I made it. Like maybe if I just pretend like I had this big breakthrough, like I had my moment, my epiphany, then it will actually come. But if I just hung on a little bit longer, it would. And it did. And I don't think that I've cried or released that much energy ever as I did that day. But it was a moment that was crucial in pivoting the rest of my life going forward. So intensives are we couldn't call home, we couldn't text. We were again shut off from the rest of the world to be able to just focus on ourselves and really learn how to live with ourselves through the guidance of a mental health expert. It is fearful. When you walk into a situation with 5 other people that you don't know and they're strangers, you become family very fast. And you mentioned earlier the power of support groups. There is power in the group because even though our stories weren't all exactly the same, there was something about going through that experience together that we are bound together for the rest of our lives. And I am truly grateful that I had the opportunity to do that. I was also grateful for the body-based healing methods. And when I say body-based, again, I mean something beyond just cognitive therapy. And there's different variations of that. There's EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. And then there are trauma release exercises, brain gym, all of these different things that you can do with your body to recenter yourself or refocus or unlock memories. When I saw the importance of that for me, I wanted to bring that back to our community. And because that had been such a vital part in my healing and my recovery, I wanted to offer that in the community. But again, those things can be expensive. Those sessions for
Mhm.
EMDR can be hundreds and hundreds of dollars for a couple of hours. And so that was part of the heart of creating the foundation, was to allow people to have those healing experiences who might not have gotten it otherwise. I didn't want socio and economic status to be a barrier to receiving care, and I don't think that it ever should be. And I was fortunate to do that intensive. I think knowing what I know now, I would still do it again. As terrifying as it was, I know that 6 days of my life that I carved out to work on just me, that it transformed me for the rest of my life, because I know that I can't ever go back to the Maya who didn't know herself or understand herself. I couldn't go back to essentially playing dumb about my emotions. I now understood. And instead of looking at that as a negative, it was absolutely like a toolkit. It was like having a drill and a sledgehammer to start saying, okay, what are we going to start breaking down? You understand it now. You understand why you're doing these things. You understand what this behavior is. So let's get to work. And I would recommend anyone who's interested in looking into something like that to make sure that they've done the work prior to, because I was in therapy for a number of years before I did an intensive. And I don't know that I would have been able to just open the door and walk right into that if I had never experienced at least some therapy sessions before that.
Absolutely, and thank you for emphasizing that because it's much like someone who goes to any sort of intensive, whether you're a writer and you're going to a writing intensive, or a ballet dancer, you're going to a ballet intensive. When you're doing a mental health intensive, you do want some awareness and some strength under your belt because, as you're saying, the intensives, I've done one in my life and it wasn't of the same ilk as yours. But when you are in that sacred container of self work 24/7 with other people, no distractions, and you're accessing parts of the body, mind, and spirit that you may have walled off for years. There is a lot that comes up, and you do want some definite skills under your belt before you go into that realm. So, when we look at our listener's question, and you're giving great tips and tools about individual therapy, group therapy, intensives, looking into what is available online and within your community. There are many times in a community, whether through a nonprofit, through a hospital, a clinic, where we can find resources that are free or low cost, which is one of the beauties of group support. Many group services are very low cost, and we want to be able to open that door for ourselves because, as you say, the trauma is healed only through the body mind spirit connection because trauma is held in the body. And as an EMDR practitioner, I know, that bilateral stimulation that we can also get somewhat of a dose of through walking, right? Left, right, which is what we're doing in EMDR with special tools and special scripts. And we want the listeners to know that the jargon, don't let the jargon scare you. Leave the jargon to the professionals. The key pieces are that you deserve healing. You are not broken. You did not cause the trauma that came your way, no matter how much you've been gaslit to believe that you did cause it, that you deserved the abuse or whatever it was. No. Answer there is just a hard no. And any way that you start that feels comfortable to you, that first step forward, if you persevere, if you continue, with supportive people like you, Maya, and your One in Three Foundation, and all of the work you do, and being a model of someone who has gone through that fire to heal, to come out the other side, to give back, to be, a light for other people. I just think it's so beautiful. And thank you for that. And one more piece, because you brought up so many points, I want to touch on them all. When someone has suffered from abuse and they either have PTSD, complex PTSD, we don't want to underestimate that hypervigilance that lives within the being, the body, mind, spirit 24/7, where you're just listening, you're walking on eggshells, you're waiting for, the other shoe to drop, so to speak. Your radar is up all the time. And as you said, those heightened levels of adrenaline and cortisol, that's not good for the body. It does not allow the immune system to function properly. And so, with too much adrenaline and cortisol constantly coursing through your body and not having an opportunity to let down, to feel safe, of course you're going to be more susceptible to illnesses of all sorts. So thank you for bringing that up as well. It's such an important piece. And when we do the work to move forward and to get into situations where we can learn to live with less of that stress response, that fight flight response constantly living within us, it's a new life ahead, isn't it?
It truly is. And I think one of the things that I've taken away from all of my experiences is to know when I'm at my limit and to know when my body is telling me enough. um, I laugh because I have jokingly said before it's almost like my body's in a temper tantrum where it's like, no, I'll get on the computer or, oh, I need to go across town or drive, 30 minutes this way to do this. And I just feel this, sag of energy. And it's like your body is going, no, you have done what you can physically do today. And I used to ignore that and push past it. And then that would only lead to burnout, which is another symptom of all of those things of being in a, as you said, a heightened state of hypervigilance all the time. But I have learned to listen to the cues that my body is giving me. If I get a headache, if I have an upset stomach, if I feel if I'm not getting a good night's sleep, if I'm having a lot of restlessness, I can turn internally now and start self-assessing and asking, okay, what's going on? What has me feeling this way? Sometimes it's a very natural thing. There's a million things going on with the career or with the child, and those are natural responses, but it's also a sign sometimes to take a step back. And one thing I do want to say to encourage listeners as well is, I can talk about these things and my experiences and going to an intensive and use the jargon and these terms, but that does not by any means mean that I do not still struggle. And it is a lifelong journey. There are periods where things are at ease. There are periods where I have weekly therapy appointments and then I can taper them off once I feel like I'm leveling out. But I have also had to learn how to incorporate meditation, deep breathing exercises,
Yes.
yoga, because for me, it was a matter of, and I say this a little lightly, but kicking my own tail. I needed that adrenaline rush of working out and doing these, superhero workouts that were just pushing my body to the limit. And I've had to learn to be okay with going for a walk and taking in just the sights and the sounds and just stretching and being okay with that as movement and not trying to tear myself down. So I want to say that you can do the work and feel good, and then you might have to do the work again. That does not make you a failure. It just means you're a human being and that life comes at all of us and that we all face different times of struggles, transitions, relationships, moves, new jobs. They can exacerbate those symptoms that are there. It's okay to ask for help and it's okay to feel that you might have to go back to some of those support resources. You didn't fail, you're living your life.
Thank you for highlighting that. As as a psychologist, I know it's never, and repeating what you're saying, it's never a failure to go back. Just like anything in life, we need touch-up courses. We need touch-up courses in sports, in school, in everything. Why would we not think that something that's been hardwired into the psyche, that is so painful, childhood abuse, adult abuse, all of those things, it takes time and the journey is ongoing. And before we wrap up, I just want to give a nod to the element of perfectionism that you spoke about, because there is that sense sometimes with perfectionism, as you were saying, we strive for perfectionism for so many reasons. some of it that may have abuse underneath it. And I know in my case, my perfectionism came from, as do I see this with many people who have suffered from trauma, where if I can only get this right, if I can make this perfect, my world will be okay. If I can only do this, if I can only check off all of those boxes, I'll be safe. Nobody will yell at me. I will be loved. And so I want to be able to just pause and look sometimes. If we are perfectionists or recovering perfectionists, what are the roots of that? And the truth is, perfectionism won't, no matter how right we get it, it won't heal the trauma. It may even make it worse. So thank you, Maya. Where can our listeners find you?
I am on social media on Instagram at Good as Golden. I am also on Facebook under MGB Rights, WRITES Rights. And my website is goodasgolden.com. And my memoir, The Return Trip, released in November of 2023, and it is available amongst any of the major booksellers. And I truly appreciate this conversation and the opportunity to come on, and thank you for allowing me to share and visit.
I am so grateful for your beautiful energy, your intelligence, your compassion, all of the wisdom that you've shared. Are there any other last minute bits that we want to look at, or how did we wrap it up for you?
I want to just say, if you're interested in learning more about the 1 in 3 Foundation, we do have some programs online, and the website for the organization is the numeral 1 and then IN, the numeral 3 foundation.org. So 1in3foundation.org. We have some monthly online support group meetings for anyone that might be interested, or you can find our contact information. And if you're not sure of where there might be an organization like ours in your community, we can help direct you to one.
Oh, what a blessing you are. Thank you, Maya. Thank you for leaving a trail of goodness in your wake. I am so grateful and appreciative. And thank you, listeners, for sharing your time with us. It is a joy. And this is Imperfect Love.
Thanks so much for sharing your time with me today. Remember, you have the power to transform your life and love fearlessly, if imperfectly, and it's my privilege to help you along the way. You can find more life-changing content, including my books and other podcast episodes, at drcarlamanley.com. Feel free to submit your own confidential questions through my website. I'll do my very best to include your issue on a future episode. If you found this podcast helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Until we connect again, this is Dr. Carla Marie Manley wishing you oceans of blessings and love. Please note, this podcast is psychoeducational in nature and is not intended to replace formal mental health support. Please contact your healthcare provider or emergency hotline if you need psychiatric care. And as always, please take good care of your amazing, wonderful self.